Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Greetings and welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight I'm going to be talking to Aaron Dabbah of EsoterX, and that is EsoterX.com, and it is a fantastic blog. And I'm going to read real quick the about here on EsoterX because I think it's pretty cool. EsoterX is an anthropological investigation of the ontological status of things that go bump in the night. The fact that monsters may or may not be corporeal is of no consequence. As Charles Baudelaire said, I consider it useless and tedious to represent that which exists because nothing that exists satisfies me. Nature is ugly, and I prefer the monsters of my fancy to what is positively trivial. Born in a log cabin behind the Institute for Psychical Research, Aaron is an applied anthropologist by training, inclination, and neurosis, masquerading as a computational linguist and software engineer by day, busy accumulating obscure master's degrees in an attempt to assemble a set of letters after his name that spontaneously result in some sort of gematria significance. I'm convinced the universe is a far weirder place than we like to admit, and the only reasonable response is that recommended by Hunter Thompson: when the going gets weird, turn pro. We do an extra Patreon segment with Aaron as well, talking about a demon that once testified in court. But these are some really interesting stories. I hope you're going to enjoy it, and I plan on having him back sometime fairly soon, actually. There's a lot of stuff on his blog to go over, and he's a really interesting guy. So here we go, my conversation with Aaron Dabbah. And so I'm speaking with Aaron Dabbah of EsoterX, and the subtitle to your blog, which is what EsoterX is If Monsters Don't Exist, Why Are They Out to Get Me? And I freaking love that. How you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing great. How you doing, Trey?
All right. So tell me a little bit about where the blog came from and where the title came from.
Well, mostly it's that you're kind of reading my neurosis in print on the web, and it came from a need that I saw to differentiate strange phenomena from natural science, and to do it in the sense that there's a certain absurdity in our monsters and like things that go bump in the night. And I don't mean absurd that we kind of laugh at it and toss it out, but in the sense of absurdism, where the tendency to seek inherent meaning in life and our inability to find any. And that seems like a pretty horrible characterization of human existence, but I kind of follow H.P. Lovecraft's observation that even from the greatest horrors, irony is seldom absent. So I figure we can at least get a laugh out of it.
Okay.
I'm fascinated with strange history, and not necessarily to the extent of ancient aliens or super civilizations, but I like the little details in history that are weird and that go unnoticed mostly. A good example of that's I ran across this just recently and put an article up on it, that there was a major volcanic eruption in 1808 that changed the climate for a few years, cooled it down a bit, and no one noticed it. It was
really?
Yeah, there were other eruptions during the time. There were eruptions in the Azores, and I saw those. And there were eruptions in 1818. There was the I think it was what was it, Mount Tambora or something like that led to the year without a summer.
Right.
And people noticed these, recorded them. In 1808, there was one, nobody noticed it. The only reason they know about it is because we did some Antarctic ice cores, and they apparently study pine cones to determine if a volcanic eruption happened. And they said between 1808 and 1809, there was a colossal eruption somewhere on the planet that changed the climate. And colossal, believe it or not, is the technical term for the size of the eruption. And it goes something like mild to mega colossal, and mega colossal is like if the Yellowstone,
Right.
the caldera explodes. But the like Pinatubo was they have something called the volcanic explosivity index, and it's all about how much stuff gets thrown into the air and how high the plume is and how loud it is and things like that. And this one rated pretty high. It was like on the same order of Pinatubo, or I think it may have been near Krakatoa sized, and absolutely nobody noticed it. It was recorded. It wasn't recorded anywhere. And sometime in the late 1990s, there were some a PhD student and a professor. They were either climatologists or volcanologists, were trying to figure out why they were getting these weird core samples that said there was an eruption. So they started digging around, and the only references they could find were these guys in Bogota. It was the director of the Astronomical Observatory of Bogota between 1805 and 1810 that said something like there's a transparent cloud that's obstructing the sun's brilliance. And then another guy at the same time in Colombia said he saw something similar, and that there was that probably indicated there was like a sulfuric acid, aerosol cloud coming from a volcanic explosion somewhere west of Colombia. But and it would be 2,600 miles long, given the two guys who were were reporting it, but no one had anything to say about it. And they just guess where it happened, somewhere between Indonesia and Tonga, and that's all they can say.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's like these things that are just kind of go. I mean, Charles Fort would have called it, damn data. This is, it gets, it obviously happened, but nobody saw it, heard it, reported it. And I mean, they talked to the locals in the South Pacific, and there was, there's local folklore about eruptions, but nothing that fit the time frame. So it happened, changed the climate, nobody noticed.
That's
But I like
crazy.
that stuff. Yeah, I like stuff that spans millennia and repeats, and you hear stories again and again, and the and that you hear it from different cultures, from different uh, noted experts of the time, and a lot of these noted experts, of course, like in 1 BC, and things like
Right.
that. But a good example of this is the war between the pygmies and the cranes, which they don't teach in school, obviously.
Yeah.
And it apparently was a millennia-long conflict between pygmies and cranes that spanned several continents.
Now,
And
explain who the pygmies and cranes are.
well, the cranes are the bird.
Okay, so we're talking about an actual bird.
With the actual bird, the cranes, and pygmies. Well, I mean, that comes obviously out of the Greeks, who called anybody shorter than them and foreign a pygmy.
Yeah.
But they actually specify, and across several different cultures, that no longer than the length of a forearm. So we're talking about what, 7 inches high, a foot at most,
Huh.
and that the cranes basically carried out a genocidal war against the pygmies. And there really aren't any pygmies anymore, and there are a lot of cranes. So I guess we can tell who won.
Um. Wow. So these were really small pygmies.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the traditional. I mean, that was where the name comes from in Greek. Pygmy, it means length of the forearm, and so that foot tall, no bigger than that,
Eh,
which makes sense if you've ever run into a crane, because they're like nasty birds, and they'll take on a full-sized human if they feel like it.
Yeah.
But so obviously they wouldn't be afraid of pygmies. But it gets mentioned across the world, and dating even back to it's mentioned in Homer's Iliad as something that they already knew about, because he compares the conflict between the Greeks and Trojans to the ferocity of the ageless conflict between pygmies and cranes, which is like, wow, that he knew about it in what, 710 BC, and it had already been going on for a while, and it was apparently pretty nasty.
Well,
And
it makes me think too of the Sirius alien there too that Greer found that was only like a foot tall.
yeah, I mean, we have countless cultures have story. I mean, even you can even like look at fairies and say maybe these are
Memories of real people at some point.
yeah, some version of the pygmies that the Greeks were talking about. But the what's interesting is that you look at second century BC tombs in the Crimean Peninsula, and a lot of the tombs depict battles between pygmies and, well, in this case, they happen to be herons, but they're morphologically similar to cranes. So who can tell? Maybe your artist just couldn't tell the difference. And but and Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, in the early opening of the AD 23 AD or so, he brought up the fact that the pygmy were actually believed to have been displaced from their ancestral homeland by the cranes.
Huh. Well,
And they,
I guess it makes sense if they were literally, a foot tall or something like that, that these birds could be a terror to them.
oh, absolutely. But they apparently, the pygmies originally were in Scythia somewhere, around the Black Sea coast of Thrace. And the cranes are mentioned actually also by Aesop uh, in his fables, and said that the uh, the cranes found Greece to be kind of unfriendly and started spreading out, and started by settling on the lands of the Pygmy in Scythia, and then kept moving. And after that, the Pygmies seem to have dispersed. And you get, and in Greece, of course, anything for a good story. The Greeks talked about how the Greek gods were angry at the Pygmies, particularly a disrespectful queen of the Pygmies had pissed them off. These Greek gods, they have big egos. And it can pretty much piss them off anyway.
Right.
And they mete out punishments way out of proportion to whatever the offense is. And this queen married somebody, and Hera found fault with it, and it was a whole love triangle thing, and really ugly. But and so the pygmy were then set upon by the cranes at the behest of the Greek gods. But that's the usual. They came up with divine punishments for all sorts of things in Greece. But at that point, they were fractured, and you get stories about small clusters of them in Egypt, Ethiopia, believe it or not, Arctic Canada,
Huh.
the Himalayas, and um, they're talked about by Aristotle in about 322 BC as settled pretty solidly in southern Egypt, but getting raided continually by the cranes.
Wow.
Yeah, so these cranes are really like after them. And again, it spreads out across the world. You have 14th century AD Italian missionary, and what was his name? Friar Odric, and Arab scholars at the 14th century who were starting to have contact with China, uh, talked about remnant populations of pygmy uh, getting attacked by angry cranes in the Himalayas. And then you get Chinese records from the Chinese annals that say in the 5th century, it's the Shenai Kings, so, the big book of Chinese myths and legends and things that a lot of references are made to. And they talk about a land where there are men and women who are only 7 inches tall, that are desperately afraid of cranes, and that the cranes travel 1,000 miles and try to gobble them up,
Huh.
which is very strange.
Yeah.
But you can go from culture to culture, and the Norse talk about the scareling in uh, in in the Arctic, and they say that again the pygmy were trying to find safe havens from the cranes, and they were still set upon by these terribly nasty cranes. Um, it's mostly, obviously the cranes can project air power, so they have a slight advantage there.
What made you think to look into this more?
It was a Thoreau quote I ran across that made absolutely no sense to me, and I wanted to see what the heck he was talking about. And then it's Henry David Thoreau wrote, "Like pygmies, we fight with cranes," and that was all he said.
Hmm.
And I said, "Well, where did this come from?" What's
Right.
it all about? But you get stories from the Roman historians like Pliny about them in Egypt and Ethiopia, and it gets detailed about the conflict, the strategies that the Pygmies had for fighting them. Like they would go out to the beaches and try and break the crane's eggs before they could hatch another generation of super soldiers. And the Pygmy are said to have introduced the world's first goat and sheep-based cavalry to fight them.
Wow.
Yeah, but it continues into the into North America. There's Cherokee legends about small people that are under attack by, well, they said the local geese population, which obviously there's some sort of military compact with the cranes, but
Sure, sure.
yeah. And the Cherokee said they were quite descriptive about it. They said that the pygmy really didn't have many weapons, and the birds just stuck their long beaks into their houses and tried to pull them out and eat them. And eventually, they were wiped out. And there's other stories from other Native American groups that also mention these little people and so it's like I said, you don't see any pygmies anymore, but you do see a lot of cranes. So we kind of know what happened.
Yeah, obviously. Um, what is your okay? So when you look into this stuff, what is your take on like the more paranormal aspects of some of this stuff? Are you like a full out skeptic? Are you open minded about it? I mean, do you think there's always going to be a more down to earth explanation?
Well, I think a lot of times when I'm asked that, I think my best response is that it's the wrong question. Um, that that whether I'm a skeptic or not,
Hmm.
that in my mind, it doesn't matter whether these things are real in some objective sense. It what matters is this is a very meaningful story that's been told across cultures for 2 millennia, and that it's encoding something. Now, is it encoding something that really happened? I don't know. And do I really think there's a world war between cranes and pygmies? Yeah, well, it doesn't really matter to me whether it happened or not. What's interesting is that we've been talking about it for millennia, and and people who have had no contact with each other have been talking about it. And that's what I find interesting. And it's the sort of thing that it just sort of falls by the wayside because we're very likely to say this is history and this is folklore, and never the two shall meet. History being what we consider important, and folklore being what we consider trivial. But there's an awful lot that we miss, like the volcano, for instance,
Sure.
uh, that makes you wonder what other cataclysmic events have we missed? Now, are the cranes and the pygmies a stand-in for something else? Was there this long ongoing genocidal war between two people? It, it's a possibility, but it's interesting that it gets repeated again and again for millennia by people who wouldn't have been repeating each other's stories. They would simply have sort of in situ come up with this this story, which has to be underpinned by something. I mean, maybe they had bad encounter with a crane and wanted to make them look bad. I don't know. It just seems things like that repeat themselves. I find fascinating, especially when they repeat across cultures
Yeah, yeah. Is
and
that
across time.
yeah, because it suggests something that's either trying to be preserved or something that's ongoing.
Yeah, it's something that people noticed, and what exactly it is they noticed. Well, I mean, same thing when it comes down to UFOs. What exactly is it that somebody noticed? Uh,
Yeah.
and whether, getting to the point where you say, well, that's not real or that's real. Well, not really the point. the point the point is somebody saw something. They couldn't identify it. It's an unidentified flying object.
Right.
No, and from that point you can speculate. Oh, and it all again, the speculations I see out there tend to involve ontological assumptions that are, and the great thing about an ontological assumption, you can't really support it. That's why it's ontological.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, and I think that's true of most paranormal subjects.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, and you see this in the, you see the skeptics and the people who believe in whatever they believe in. The Bigfoot, aficionados or UFO chasers or things like that, or ghost hunters, that they get locked into this idea that they can't, uh, that there's no room for sort of a fluid meaning. That yes, I'm seeing something. No, this is not necessarily what I think it is, but it's also not necessarily what a physical scientist would say it is. And you lose a little bit of the meaning when you get into that kind of speculation, because once somebody's determined what can and can't exist, then obviously they're going to say there was never a crane and pygmy war. Okay, and it sort of ends the conversation. It's like, yeah, there likely, there wasn't an actual pygmy crane world war, but the question is, what happened? Why is everybody so interested in pygmies and cranes?
Yeah, yeah, and something, yeah,
It gets to the matter of the absurdity. uh, while you may regard life as absurd and you'll never find the existential meaning, that the search for that meaning is nonetheless valuable.
true, true. And I think that's kind of what keeps us going a lot of times.
Yeah, and you have to sometimes, strange things happen, and you need some way to encode it in your brain. And when when you need a description of what happened to you, I was kidnapped by Bigfoot, and I'm gonna have his baby. It's it sounds crazy, but in that person's mind, that's what happened. Now, it's easy to say that, well, you can dismiss that as this person is crazy, or you could say something happened to them. What is the meaning of what happened to them? And, let's put aside whether we believe in Bigfoot or whether we think he goes out and kidnaps people or any of these things. It means something. It's like the phantom clowns. Clowns are creepy, and you see a clown in a dark alley. He's scary no matter what. And yeah, what is the meaning of a sudden rash of sightings of phantom clowns? Who knows? Maybe we've gotten over the clown. Circuses are sort of going away, and things like that are becoming less and less popular. Maybe we're just done with clowns,
Hmm,
and it's a
possibly.
significant cultural meaning.
Yeah, well, it has the whole trickster archetype in there.
Yeah,
Um,
we
so
don't like tricksters. Tricksters bother us as a divine critter. We don't. Tricksters are absolutely the characterization of the absurd in religion, as far as I'm concerned, and I love them.
oh yeah, absolutely. But it's also interesting that if tricksters are presented right, for instance, Doctor Who fits the whole trickster archetype,
Oh yeah.
and then people love him. But it has to be presented just right to.
Yeah, and you know why we can stomach the trickster with the at the bottom. He's the trickster with the heart of gold. He has our best interests in mind. We just don't always know what our best interests are.
Right.
He'll come for us. Whereas that makes a trickster palatable. Whereas traditionally tricksters across various cultures don't really care that much about. They're screwing with us because they can, and they're having fun.
Well, maybe they have a bigger plan.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing. It's like maybe we just don't understand.
When we look at the UFO phenomenon, we look at all the possible facets. If it was, really behind, sightings of fairies and not really spacemen, but something else that we can't quite conceive of, they could have a plan for us that goes back millennia.
Sure.
And each individual encounter doesn't tell us anything about that plan because
No.
we're looking at it in too small of a scope and we'll never see the full scope of it.
And
I think
that's why a lot of the descriptions of encounters seem vaguely surreal because they make no sense. I mean, maybe they mutilate cattle because they hate cows. I don't know.
maybe. There was a war once between the cows, and
The cows and the aliens, yeah.
but when you look at it that way, it's like maybe Valet was right, and they're just kind of like forcing our evolution in certain directions, forcing our culture in certain directions, but we wouldn't see it.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a bigger plan, there's no. It's like, can we understand what dolphins want, for instance?
Right.
What would a dolphin tell us if we could talk to a dolphin? And probably have a very different view on reality. And but would we be able to comprehend? I think we think of sentience as we put look at all our sci-fi. We put aliens in human suits,
Yes.
or
Yes.
humans in alien suits, and then relate, or rather, humans in alien suits, and then we relate to them as we would other humans. It's very hard for us, either that or they're like, like aliens, face hugger things where they're just, mindlessly out to kill us.
Right.
And I'm more worried about that kind. The other kind, they're they're amusing, but they're
There are
not.
some exceptions, like the stuff like Arrival, where they were certainly not human in any way, but yet not
Yeah,
here to kill us.
yeah,
But
a
that's the
few.
exception.
you know but mostly we think that because something is sentient, we will relate to it on a level that we would relate to another human being, and that's a big assumption.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same way that we apply like human traits to animals.
Yeah,
Your cat can mimic what you did, so it must be that it has that same meaning to the cat, but it doesn't. The cat just knows how to get a response. So you teach your dog to shake hands, but that's not a greeting to the dog.
yeah, yeah. The cat's purring, he's happy. What he's really doing is probably like plotting your death.
Well, aren't they all?
Yeah.
That's also a long-term plan. Um, let one of the things you mentioned when we were talking, emailing back and forth, I just lost the tab. There was something moonface people
Oh, the Moonface people. Yeah, that's another genocidal war that nobody talks about. The
or moon-eyed people is what you said.
Moon-eyed people. Yeah, the that's in North America, um, and a lot of this gets kind of sucked into the whole Columbus was a jerk and let's find anybody else who first discovered America kind of stuff, which is,
Hmm.
always amusing. Obviously, the Vikings got here at some point, and
Sure.
there's even a few thing about Chinese Buddhist monks on the Pacific coast in the 5th century AD, and
Yeah.
which I always think explains a lot about California. But the uh, the big-eyed, the technical name for them was the Asgan, and they stories of them were first found in territory between West Virginia and Georgia, and Europeans started meandering into the frontiers of Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, about in the early 1700s, and the Shawnee were the tribe that was occupying the area in Ohio at the time, and they sent out a guy named Thomas Bullitt to Chillicothe, Ohio, to request permission from the Shawnee because they want to open up some of the land in Kentucky, which was absolutely beautiful. And the Shawnee told them they were basically on crack because the Shawnee would hunt in Kentucky, but they absolutely refused to set up any permanent settlements there. And they said they didn't own the land. And when they asked them who does own the land, they said it was the ghosts of the murdered Asgan tribe.
Huh.
And the way they described them, they called them the moon-eyed people. They're moon-eyed nocturnal creatures. I mean, so we're not talking about a group of Caucasians running around. They were pretty clear. These are moon-eyed, pale-skinned people that can't come out in the light, which sounds awfully like the Living Dead to me. But that's where I go to,
Or the mole people.
or the mole people, exactly. So they clearly were. They by the time they were telling these stories, they were pretty much familiar with the white settlers. So they were pretty sure that these were not the same thing, and the Europeans went ahead and started setting up farms and whiskey distilleries and whatever else they wanted to in Kentucky. And the natives said, we call that they had a name for it that translated as the dark and bloody ground, and they're like, we call it that for a reason. And there's some fictionalized accounts of these discussions between the Shawnee and Thomas Bullitt that get repeated on the internet all the time as if they're real. That you can look at the folklore and get the folklore very easily, but then there's also some fictionalized accounts, and I don't think we actually have a record of the conversation between Chief Blackfish and Thomas Bullitt.
Right, right. Wait, you mean they weren't? They didn't have like a stenographer there recording everything?
Yeah. Somebody wrote a book called The Frontiersman. I can't remember his name. It was Eckert. Eckert was the guy's name. And it was written in 1967. And actually, Church of Latter-day Saints picked up on it. And as evidence that the Book of Mormon correctly depicts, unruly white people crawling around North America preaching the gospel.
Yeah.
But the stories that they have that they right around about 1500 AD, Spanish conquistador reported these stories that were being told to him, but that they weren't around by the time he had arrived. And the Cherokee legends, they talk about how they were in the vicinity of Georgia. And the Cherokee were actually an Iroquoian people, so they migrated south, probably from somewhere around the Great Lakes. And they probably pushed, and the way it worked was, one tribe would start moving south, and they'd push a tribe in front of them, and so on and so forth. And the Cherokee moved through southern Appalachia into Kentucky and Tennessee and the Carolinas, and then into Georgia, where they eventually encountered settlers. But they reported that they displaced the Moon-eyed people from Kentucky as they worked their way through. And the Shawnee of Ohio say that they wiped them out completely, which is interesting. You got different tribes saying that they did different things. So the Shawnee said they wiped them out, but the Cherokee say, well, when we arrived, there were still some there. And we agreed, don't settle in Kentucky. And they kept pushing south and wound up pushing, apparently, these Moon-eyed people, the Asgen, into Tennessee and then into Georgia. And when the Cherokees arrived in Georgia, there was immediately conflict with the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks. Everybody was fighting for land and territory. And the Creeks, interestingly, who were probably in southern Appalachia and Georgia before the Cherokee arrived, had a similar tradition of the Moon-eyed people and said they wiped them out. They got a lot of people who are like openly saying, yeah, there were these, nocturnal critters, and they're day blind and moon-eyed and pale-skinned, and we wiped them out. And this tradition persists across a lot of these, across multiple tribes that all seem to be quite proud of having wiped out moon-eyed people. And there's been some speculation that some of the ruins that you see in the hills in Georgia are sort of the last stand of the of the Asgen before they were completely wiped out.
Huh. Yeah, I've never heard about that. That's really interesting.
What's interesting about it is that there was a weird pattern of settlement where in what was geographical Kentucky and West Virginia and sort of that area, fertile land, but relatively sparsely settled by Native Americans. And this is while tribes were all around fighting for land and pushing each other in, farther south or farther west. And yet nobody really wanted to settle in that area. And it was all about these moon-eyed Asgen.
Well, there are also the Native American legends about how they wiped out giants and like the red-haired giants and stuff, and then we found actual mummies of red-haired giants in a
Yeah.
cave, and it's like, okay, well, maybe there was something to these stories.
Yeah. Oh, and lots of stories about a version of fairies that interacted with Native Americans that at some point were either wiped out or disappeared. There's these stories reoccur all over the place.
Hmm. The same with like the whole Bigfoot thing in Native Americans. You get that in a lot of Native American cultures acknowledge that Bigfoot is out there in different ways.
Oh yeah, and wild men and things like that. And the
Yeah.
funny thing is, a lot of that. I mean, maybe it's encoding something, and that's always been my point. Is I wrote one recently on the Basque,
Hmm.
and the Basque. What's interesting about them is that their language is the only language in Europe that bears no resemblance to any other European language. It's not from the Indo-Aryan, Indo-European family of languages. And there's other genetic things that mark a distinct Basqueness that indicate they've been there for right there at the end of the western end of the Pyrenees for a very, very, very long time.
Now, don't they have a unique blood type as well?
Yeah, I forget whether it's Rh negative or Rh
Yeah.
positive, but it's like
Yeah.
it's usually represented in the population way above anybody else, any other population. So there's a lot of genetic uniqueness there that has, and that coupled with the language, they know that the Basques were there at least before agriculture arrived in Spain. So that puts it back 7,000 years. But there's some speculation that the Basque may be a remnant of indigenous populations that were there when the Indo-Europeans came sweeping out of the out of Asia, Central Asia into Europe. And the what I found fascinating is there's lots, and so given that there's the possibility that the Basque could have been there for 25,000 years, that would not be a completely unreasonable assumption. But that would almost, according to, yeah, and our notion of when there, we do, anthropologists agree there was some overlap in Europe between Cro-Magnon, I mean, the first Homo sapiens,
Hmm.
and Neanderthals, and that there the dates are a little uncertain. I mean, sometimes they say the last Neanderthal probably died somewhere around 40,000 years past, but they
Yeah.
say in Spain that it actually lasted a lot longer. And the time frame is such that stories that the Basques have of something they call the gentilac, which, and I'm probably terribly mispronouncing it because I don't speak a word of Basque. It's a furry giant, 10, 15 feet tall. It's grown a lot in retelling, but they talk about them as having lived in the mountains, and they shared some farming techniques with the Basque, and they just talked about interacting with these more or less gentle giants living up in the hills. And you got to ask yourself, if the Basque were there for 25,000 years and in some at some point overlapped uh, the the last of the Neanderthal, an earlier Cro-Magnon group, is that so hard to believe? And that's a kind of a theme with me is I like to find things where you can say, is that so hard to believe? And then I pull a bait and switch and say, well, if you believe that, let me tell you another one.
And the thing is, our history is so incomplete. And the further, you don't even have to go that far back, like the volcano you mentioned, to show how little we really know about history.
Well,
We,
yeah, all you got to do is look up a list of phantom islands and
yeah.
all the islands we've lost. They were there at one point, we lost them, or maybe they were never there and somebody just couldn't navigate. It's it's
Or they're holdovers from when, from the ice age, when these things were above water before the ice caps melt.
yeah, and there's lots and lots of things we seem to miss. I mean, Gobekli Tepe
Yeah.
is a good thing that sat there, nobody noticed it for a long time, and now they're seeing something they would have presumed could not exist previously.
Yeah, well, the water damage on the Sphinx, that was, not
Yeah.
a welcomed discovery, and the Antikythera mechanism.
Yeah. I just countless things that just don't have a really good explanation. And some of them I like because they're just so odd. The Antikythera mechanism I like because it's like, what is that, and why does that exist?
Yeah.
And there's no real good explanation for it.
And the thing is, it's not. I don't know. I don't know if there's no good explanation for it. It's that we've obviously missed something.
Or it seems, given our current timeline, it seems out of time.
Yeah.
That it's it's not whatever an anachronism is going forward, because it seems that our history says at this time this could not have existed, yet here it is, and it exists.
Right. And if it exists on that form, there must have been previous forms, and we've just never found them. So what else are we
Yes.
missing?
Yeah, stuff burns, we break stuff, it gets buried. We have cataclysms that we don't notice. So
Exactly.
it's surprising how much we lose, and if it gets written down, it's remembered and it becomes history. And
Or it's assumed that it's myth,
yeah, if it's
depending on who
strange,
wrote it down.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, Aristotle had plenty of weird stuff to say, and we take him seriously.
And we take Plato seriously about everything but Atlantis.
Yeah, well, and that's funny. It's like we read it, and the guy's this is genius, but Atlantis never existed. Well, maybe it didn't, but he was talking about something. Maybe it was just a metaphor. But again,
Right.
These things don't, unless the guy's a great fiction writer, and then we want to say that he's a fantastic fiction writer. I don't think most people think of him that way. They say this guy was encoding something meaningful, and whether it was a real continent or not is not terribly important. He had something to say about it.
Well, and that's interesting too, because that's a secondhand story that was told to him.
Yeah.
So, it's not like it was told directly to him. It's already gone through one other person, if I remember right. Wasn't it Solon who told him?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's gone through one other person at least. And then, it is interesting to me because it matches up with the end of the last ice age when you look at the dates.
Yeah.
And it could be that mixed with other things that just over time got all kind of flurried together. So we get a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Well, history is a game of telephone.
Yeah.
It's you're never quite sure what the story is, and it's who writes it. And I'm not a big conspiracy theorist. Well, I can't say that exactly. I think that the problem with our modern conspiracy theories is that they're often generated by people who are very unhappy with our current consensus reality.
Hmm.
And rather than making the tweaks or doing those few obnoxious things that kind of throw a wrench into the standard consensus reality and call things into question, they want to overturn it. They want something completely different to be true. And I think that leads you down pathways that where you start making assumptions that are not necessarily supported, not necessarily wrong, but not supported.
Usually what I see when I start looking into certain conspiracies is that you get, okay, here's a fact, and here's a fact, and here's a fact, and then they tie them together in a way that could make sense, but there's no evidence that that's how they're tied together.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of people don't understand there's a difference there. Just because you could tie these two things together doesn't mean they are tied together.
Yeah, it's a narrative. It's just like I think in Foucault's Pendulum, the Umberto Eco book.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic book.
Oh yeah, he's talking. Yeah, the publisher guys are talking to an occult enthusiast, and the guy comes in and is talking to them about the latest book on pyramidology he read, and how this book talks about the pyramid essentially encodes a timeline of everything that's happened in the world, and we can predict the future based on it, and by doing the measurements properly. And they say, "Well, you believe that?" And he says, "No, hell no." And he proceeds to show them by taking a newsstand in Paris and measuring its dimensions and then predicting, similar, saying, hey,
Yeah,
look,
yeah.
we've seen in Paris, its dimensions predict, all the things that happened in history that are important. And at the end, they say, well, so you don't believe in numerology of any kind? He said, no, 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 no. It's not that I don't believe in numerology. I think what's encoded in numerology is far beyond what we're ascribing to it. He says, these things are recapitulating a bigger pattern. Which kind
Yeah,
of goes to
yeah.
what we were talking about, that like why would we understand what the what the alien actually intends to do, whether they have some long-term goal and are that to us looks absurd, but if you got a few thousand years to wait, maybe it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And the universe may have a plan for us all, but it may not be a plan that we can understand.
Or one that we like.
Yeah, well, that too. That's the concept of dharma always interested me in that, because it would be translated as right action, and the I would always hear, well, that's not really what it means from Sanskrit. It doesn't actually mean right action like we think of right action. It means this is the thing that's supposed to happen. So it's
Yeah,
not right as in good or bad. It's this is almost like this is the fated action that's
this
supposed
was
to
meant
happen.
to be. Yeah.
I remember I had watched I think PBS or something aired a mini series on the Mahabharata, and they were showing I can't remember now if it was Krishna or one of the gods talking about how he didn't want to go into this war. He didn't want to go into this battle, and they were saying, "Well, don't," and he's like, "No, it's dharma. It must happen."
Yeah, and that's probably what's going to happen to us in the next few years.
Could be. Let's hope
Yeah.
not. I mean,
Uh,
I kind of honestly, I kind of feel that way about 9/11. Like 9/11 was something that had to happen.
really.
Like I feel like it was one of those points in history that, for whatever reason, it needed to happen. I mean, as horrible as it was, and no matter who's behind it, for some reason, that was one of those things that needed to happen. And I wonder too, with the random number generators and stuff, where they all kind of stopped being random when it happened.
Yeah.
If that's an
Well,
indication of that, or if that's just consciousness doing that.
do you think it's sort of it woke people up to something?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it obviously changed our world in drastic ways.
Yeah.
For better or worse can only be seen in time. I mean, it seems like it changed it for worse immediately, but who knows 20 or 30 years down the line.
It's true.
Um, let's hit one more of the things that you had brought up here, which was the Nittaweo. Yeah, you're gonna have to say that one. Nittaweo
The Nito
genocide.
genocide. Yeah, that was another interesting little bit of folklore that involves another group of people getting completely wiped out, which I find it strange that there's so many stories where it's sort of celebrated that people have just basically massacred another people,
Right.
and it's this particular one is, oh gosh, I got to remember where exactly it happened. I'm pretty sure that it was in Ceylon. Sorry, I write a lot of these things, and so
Yeah,
I get,
yeah. No, I
I
know.
get, so there's the sorry. So there's stories in Ceylon, so modern day Sri Lanka, that come from fifth century Greek historians,
Mhm.
and where they talk about that in India there are a group of people that I'm trying to get the description right. The smallest, again, this actually kind of sounds like the Pygmies again, by the way. Um, Although they didn't fight the cranes. Uh, they said they speak the same language as the other inhabitants of the country. They're very short, the tallest being only 2 cubits in height, and can't I think that's what, like a foot and a half.
Mm.
Most of them only 1.5. Very long hair, beards larger than those of any other men, And when their beards are full grown, they leave off wearing clothes. And
They sound like the sort of myth, the sort of fantasy image of like a dwarf or something.
yeah, a little bit. And then they fasten their hair around them like a girdle. It serves them as clothes. And they, of course, the Greeks, and so they called them snub nosed and ugly because anybody who wasn't Greek was, may as well have been a savage. And but these guys are reported later by a Moroccan scholar who traveled on a grand tour of North Africa, Horn of Africa, West Africa, Middle East, South Asia. Went everywhere, Southeast Asia and China, and he published it in a book called the Rila, I believe it's called. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that translates to journey. And he hopped a ship in Calcutta, which stopped in Sri Lanka, and there he picked up a similar story where he, of course, said, "Oh, this is probably just some unknown species of monkey." But the locals insisted this is not a monkey. These are people, and they had distinct descriptions of them, and that they were basically wiped out before he had ever arrived. Um, he continuously referred to them as monkeys, but locals referred to them as the Nittaweo. And the Nittaweo, he was told, were a cruel and savage race of men. And they built platforms in trees, covered them with leaves and thatch. They spoke Sinhalese and Tamil and the various languages, but their language sounded odd. And they attacked anybody who intruded into their territory because their territory apparently was where there was lots of honey, and so people went in there to collect honey, and they would attack them. And their ancestors fought the Nittaweo and drove them into a cavern. The last remnant of them piled firewood outside the entrance and burned it, and basically, suffocated them. And the it's interesting to see some of the explanations because a lot of British civil servants would speculate on what these were, and some said, "Oh no, they're just talking about sun bears, which are local there." And like, no, they're pretty clear. These aren't bears or monkeys.
Yeah, yeah. Explanations like that assume that the other people telling the stories are not smart enough to know the difference.
Yeah, it's and frankly, a lot of these people would probably be better acquainted with the animals that that the
Yeah,
British civil servants were identifying than the British civil servants. And they lived in. It's amazing because they pulled so much ethnographic information on these from locals that they lived in small gangs of 10 or 20, and they had they captured animals by surrounding them, and that's why they lived in small troops, and they tended to live in caves and hollow trees, and the females were shorter than the males. They spoke a language that was a little bit like the twittering of birds, but they understood these other languages. They were very afraid of dogs. Uh, they never came near the sea. Um, they just had the informants that they were speaking to had such rich ethnographic data on these people that it's like they knew they weren't bears or monkeys, and they were pretty clear on what had happened. But and they said that around 1400 AD, as far as they could tell, they'd been wiped out. It was basically they said 400 years before the British anthropologists and civil servants who were there interviewing them had arrived, which would have made it about 1400 AD, that they had wiped out the Nittaweo completely.
Hmm.
And these are the sort of things that, like, you just wonder. It's like, what in the world was going on? Because they're very clear that these aren't humans per se, and they're not animals. They have a culture. They apparently a pretty rich culture, given the descriptions, and yet they they were wiped out. Which is, of course, that's the whole history of humanity: is one bunch of savages coming after another bunch of savages and pushing them out. I mean, it's colonialism in a nutshell,
Yeah, yeah.
It's been going on forever, and but what's interesting is that the the detail with which these things from the Asgen in North America to the Pygmy Crane Wars, the detail with which these things are described by people sort of precludes the idea that they're just telling tales, that this is just, haha, let's make fun of the stupid European and tell them a tall tale.
Right, right.
Because it's repeated across many informants, and they're told some pretty horrific things. I mean, you'd want to at least make yourself look a little better, wouldn't you?
You would think. But then
Yeah,
again, there's the whole idea that our mankind itself just kind of uh is proud of the war that it commits.
yeah.
So
Well,
those are victories that they are proud of.
yeah. It's but yeah, and when we destroy the Earth, it'll probably be by mistake.
Yeah, well,
But yeah, and there's some truth to that. A lot of mythology is quite horrific and is about the besting of some horrible creature or some terrible people. So
yeah,
there's a lot of truth to that. What's interesting is that they get repeated. These stories are repeated again and again, and that often an element of this, there's a moral element to the story. Where take the Asgen for instance, that even though everybody seemed to claim to have a hand in wiping them out, they avoided their territory because they were the murdered ghosts, which is an interesting take on it. It's that, wow, we killed these guys, we murdered these guys, and they probably aren't happy with us. But you see how there's like a moral lesson twisted in there. It's like we did something wrong, and we're now afraid to live in the area where this happened. So it's interesting. It doesn't quite fit with the standard model of the mythological model of we went and we knocked around the the nasty Trojans because Greeks are so awesome and we they deserved it.
right, right.
But they or the Spartans versus the Persians and all those kinds of stories. They don't have a strong moral lesson to them, and that's why I find some of the ones where they have a very odd element like that, more appealing because it just doesn't fit with sort of our standard model of mythology and folklore.
Yeah.
It's the while folklore is supposed to talk about liminal things, I think the interesting, the most interesting folklore is the folklore that uh, talks about the liminal things, so things that are liminal even to folklore.
Fair enough. Um, so where can people find you?
Where can people find me?
Yes.
Uh, under my desk, hiding in fear.
Okay. That's from the monsters, right?
Exactly. You mean the blog?
I do mean the blog.
Okay, you can find it at esoterx.com. That's ESOTERX.com.
Okay. Are you on any social networking sites as well?
I'm on Tumblr, esoterx, esoterx.tumblr.com. I'm on Twitter at esoterx. I can only handle so much social media before I have a meltdown, so I'm not on
Understandable.
Facebook.
All right. Well, thank you so much for spending some time talking to us about this. The blog is great. You got such a variety of information there, and I love the frightening thoughts along the side.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And then I do have thing on the blog. It's called Small Bites of Strangeness from EsoterX, and that's if you'll notice a lot of my articles are very long and heavily referenced and tend to go on and on. My wife won't even read some of them. She says they're too long. Um, but I those small bites of strangeness are from an earlier blog that I wrote that I decided that I'd preserve here, and then it connects to the Tumblr account that also has all of my other esoteric stuff. So if you just want some quick reads, you can read about dog deaths on Overton Bridge, which is the most dangerous place on Earth for depressed pets,
Huh.
uh, or the D list of fallen angels, or various little uh, little little articles dashed off. If you want to know where all the ancient Roman ghosts are, that kind of thing.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you again.
Sure, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. As I said, there was a Patreon extra segment with Aaron talking about a demon who once testified in court. It's a pretty interesting story. And remember, you've been listening to Where Did the Road Go? And you can find everything Where Did the Road Go related at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And that's links to all of our media, all of the ways to follow us, and Patreon accounts, and everything else you could possibly need. So go check it out.